So thanks again for showing up. I really appreciate it. These are required slides. They do not represent my personal level of aggression towards cell phones, but there you are. Let me talk about me a little bit, I think. So how many of you guys identify with the term analyst? A lot. Cool. Me too. So my path is I studied math and physics at NYU, and then my first career was in banking. I was a credit analyst. I hated it. It was boring. I don't know. Sorry if anyone works in finance. No absolute judgment there, but it wasn't for me. And so by 1997, 98, I'd moved out of banking and was working in technology at IBM in New York in support of some very early internet-oriented initiatives by IBM. But what was cool about that is that it totally got the internet into my head and exposed me to some really smart people that were thinking very futureward within IBM at that point. I moved to the Bay Area. Probably not a lot of people remember Alta Vista, but it was once the largest search engine. I think it was the first to index 1 billion pages. Just missed its shot based on a few wrong calls there. But I worked there, and then at Eventbrite, early stage employee there, head of growth, even though that wasn't the title. I was a sort of growth hacker, despised the term a little bit, but of course, one appreciates the buzz. So I was definitely a growth hacker at Eventbrite, also at Prezi, head of growth there, and now I'm at a company called ChartCube, which I hope you all will check out at the end of this. So here's the agenda. This is an original presentation. I have not put together this material before. I prepared it with what I imagined about this audience in advance. That's why I asked if you guys are analysts, since that's kind of my orientation. So my hope is to kind of just share with you the things we think about and some of the broad principles and frameworks that we use in doing what we do in software in terms of measurement and analytics. And so that's a quick look at the agenda in advance. We have that many slides to go through. Did that one. Cool. So this is why software as a category, I think, is such an exciting measurement space. You not only have to render useful insight to the company, but you have to solve for how to do it each time. So that's really exciting. I don't want to assume, but I would guess that there's probably somewhat more methodological stability in measuring physical things, right? How many of you guys work at companies that have physical goods? Physical goods. So caring about the measurement of physical goods, I think, brings with it a lot of basics, like items on a shelf, things like that, right? So the complexity we face in this space comes from the extremely broad, some would say, unlimited scope of things that you can do with software. It also relates to the different platforms and devices where people use software. And also another dimension of complexity is that the technologies we use to create and deliver software to people is continuously changing, right? Again, as compared to, say, the way we move potato chips into consumer hands, right? Might be some innovation there at the R&D side in chip development, but it's probably a pretty traditional way of doing that for a very long time. There's this idea that measurement is cheap in software because it's in the digital realm. It's true that in software we can install telemetry pretty much at will, once you have a framework, of course. But this also causes a kind of metrical blindness I've seen at some software companies. In these cases, there's lots of measurement, even quite deeply in some areas, but absent what I would call an organizing perspective, sometimes the most important numbers don't come to the fore or get attention. And By that I mean the non-obvious events that are the triggers for exponential improvement. The classic example from Facebook some of you guys may have heard of is on the early days in their growth team, they noticed that something fundamental changed in user behavior once you reached 6 friends, right? And so that discovery coming from the data informed strategy and product development in that direction with great success. By the way, feel free to raise hands. This is dense, and maybe the best moment to take questions is as they arise, so I'm not particularly opinionated on that, so feel free. Cool. We're going to go through a couple of metaphors before we get into the hard stuff, but I think it's rewarding. So I found the mall metaphor useful in getting across a conceptual bridge from a physical orientation to a digital one. A mall is a great intermediary metaphor as a pre-step when we begin to think about measurement, because it has some organizing principles and a lot of chaos. The organizing principles in a mall system, you might say, are the many individual and aggregated desires of the patrons, the customers, the commercial imperatives and concerns of the individual merchants, and the higher order commercial interests of the mall operator. Right? All of these things are at play in the mall system, and of course there are many more external influences, the weather, the economy, but mainly we want to focus on things we have some capacity to influence and control. So for purposes of this exercise, we'll put ourselves in the role of the individual operator of a store in the mall. Doesn't matter what kind of store, but let's say it's a comic book store. And you as a proprietor of this comic book store want to optimize that part of your business that, let's say, is external to the store. What I mean by that is, let's say you've already sort of internally optimized getting the maximum performance out of the people that are already coming into your store, whatever that means to you, whether it's transaction or retention, et cetera. You've already done that, and so now you're interested in bringing more people into your store, right? This is hard because it includes things outside of your control, but it's a thought exercise, so we're free here. So what do you know? You already know how many people come through your door each day, but you don't know, let's say, how many people enter the mall each day. Maybe the management is nice and they give you this report, right? But probably that's not something you know. So in our telemetric thought exercise, we might begin by installing measurement at each of the mall's doors, right? Our comic book store is on level 3 towards the back, so maybe we also want to know how many people come up, how many of the total come up through the escalators, and so on. So maybe we install measurement there. So by installing measurement, we could know these things and form a picture of how people flow through the mall and past our store, right? And so the reason I'm doing this is because maybe as the proprietor of this comic book store, I have a hypothesis that some number of the people who would buy books are in the mall every day, but because they don't know I'm there or because they don't see a sign, they're never aware, and so they never come. So to take action on such a hypothesis, I might consider installing signs at key locations, right? I could inform those experiments quantitatively first by knowing the number of people flowing past those different parts of the mall, different times of day. Maybe you also want to make sure you don't count people more than once. Maybe it would be interesting for you to know what other stores in the mall people visit, right? If this is starting to sound digital, there's a reason for that. So the point is the installation of telemetry, the collection of data, comes right from the mechanical problem of getting people to do what you want. In this case, it's a comic book store. In software analytics, we proceed exactly the same way. We measure what we intend will happen, right? So this is the second metaphor, right? So in the prior metaphor, we showed how we could use intent to guide the installation of telemetry in a physical system that already had some organizing principles, right? Before we jump completely into the digital realm, let's consider one more semi-physical metaphor to learn the value of the funnel. So think of this garden as this space of a certain size, and it has objects, random in size and at determinable locations. And in the beginning, there's nothing there, right? It's just this space, this potential measurement space. And then you see it in the way on the lower left, right? And that's kind of like flipping a switch, right? It's a bit like trying to get people from the entrance of the mall to the store. But here we have no pre-existing structures at all. There's only the space and the intent we decide we want to bring to it for users. So the power of the funnel in software is you can instantly create a path of intention between two actions simply by deciding to measure how many people get from one to the other, simply by establishing that ratio. And then once you're armed with that quantitative ratio, on the possible solution side, you could pursue the optimization problem to the limits of your imagination, right? If you don't want to be too intrusive in the garden, you could set up a sign. A bit more intrusively, you build a path adjacent to the kinds of powers that we have in software. You could decide that getting people from A to B is so important that you install a teleportation booth, which is not unlike sort of the get people from here to there kinds of things we can do when we want to in software. How you guys feeling about things so far? Grokking it? Cool. So we've looked at some metaphors. We've considered the broad scope of potential in terms of software measurement. So now I want to share with you these quadrants of user data as sort of I imagine them as my sort of experience bears out that they tend to exist in software companies. So this is deliberately broader than what is easy to measure, since I think it's useful to find those edges in each case. The grid shows what functional domain in the organization is usually most involved in that data quadrant. And what I really like about this perspective is that this is relevant to a startup, and it's relevant to a big company, even a big company that would have more resources to, say, throw into the less accessible things like quadrant 4, research, et cetera, machine learning, and whatnot. So I'll go through these real quick. The how did you get here quadrant, we're talking about software, right? So generally this type of data comes right out of the mechanics that we use to deliver people to our software. So links to websites, links to app stores. And these links usually contain identifiers. At the end of the day, this is the data that we transport. These identifiers would be stored either by a third-party service, like Google Analytics or HubSpot, if that rings a bell to anyone, or in your own database, in your own place of storage, as you may decide is worth doing. For quadrant 1, the key utility for this data comes from being able to relate it to deeper product use. I cannot stress the importance of being able to have a continuous data relationship between these identifiers, the things that tell you where people came from, and ultimately the data that shows you what people are doing deeper in the product. And I'll talk about that importance a bit more deeply later. Moving on to the second quadrant, who you are is a potentially big existential data territory, but we have the power in software to fill in some of the blanks based on a combination of what people tell you and the things that you can ascertain about them. Here, and by ascertain, I'm generally talking about cookie technologies. You guys are all participants in the ongoing conversation about what is known about you and by whom, and so cookies are a primary technology through which attributes about you are conveyed to other parties and other systems, right? So the who you are bucket is a combination, like I said, of the things that you're able to get people to tell you directly and the things that you're able to ascertain. Here, as in the prior bucket, we have the option to build some of these data collection processes ourselves, or to rely on third parties to give us that kind of enrichment. If the latter, if we rely on third parties for quadrant 2 data, then the challenge is always how can we bring this data into relation with other sources, right? Siloing of this sort is a continuous problem, and I'll show you how we address these heterogeneity problems later. In this bucket, whether we do it ourselves or with third parties, we rely on cookie technology, as I said. Just to be clear, what I mean by attributes, we can read things from your browser, we can know your language, we can collect your IP address. So when you have multiple data points like this that are coming from different sources, this is how in software we build as complete and interesting a picture of the user record, potentially as possible. Again, having conquered the siloing and the heterogeneity problems. So the what have you done in the product bucket I think is the most fun because it's a completely blank canvas. The user data that comes out of the product is based on the events that you instrument, and it is all arbitrary, as I suggested in the Magic Garden slide. You have, of course, a theory about how people will use the product, and it's with this theory that you should start when instrumenting your application. At least that's the growth mindset, which I think I'm representing here. That you establish these higher order relationships metrically first. You can instrument software quite deeply, and my point is, if we want to go back to the Magic Garden example, I think if the goal is to get people from one end of the garden to the other, then you begin by installing that ratio before, say, you're worried about counting the number of leaves on the individual trees, right? Just to really stretch that metaphor. Let me talk a little bit about our model. So in software, we usually collect data based on what is called a user model, where events, things that happen in software, are recorded in logs of semi-structured data containing metadata, user identifiers, timestamp, etc. I'll talk about how we turn that into insight later when I talk about the components of the analytics stack. In advanced analytics scenarios, we may also have an object model. And by that I mean that some kinds of software let you make things like Eventbrite. You can publish an event page. At Prezi, you can make Prezis. At ChartCube, you can make chart cubes. And in analytics, if we care about these objects as independent data entities, we would put in place the data architectures necessary to treat them that way. Quite often in our analyses, what we want to start with is a list of objects, say, as opposed to a list of people. Cool. So that takes care of what have you done. And so what do you think is a very interesting metrical territory? Because what you're trying to do here is you're trying to use data to arrive at knowledge about a qualitative mind state. Of course, your data collection can include conventional methods like surveys and NPS, but it's much more fun and I think interesting to this crowd to think about modeling things with data. So I should say that it's not a lot of software companies that generate the volume or the type of data necessary to really guess at what people think. Just to give you some examples, at Prezi we had millions of presentations as an aggregate mass of content to look into. What people are making presentations about, both individually and in the aggregate, is a good corpus of data from which to guess at mind state. And we did some cool stuff on the recommendation front there, trying to guess at what people might like to see in content, using a bit more than sort of the obvious semantic approaches in many recommendation systems. By the way, if anybody has questions about any of this stuff later, love an email, jack@chartcube. Just to finish off on that, you can be sure that Facebook, for example, has put a lot of work, and not only into modeling mind state with data, but also further into the productization of those mind states as something that advertisers can target. However we generate that data, the data types that usually result are scores and indices, values that are arrived at through very computationally intensive means, but that have significant value to the system, etc. So, I'm going to describe now an analytics stack, sort of in a typical situation. You know, we've covered, like I said earlier, the metaphors, and we learned from the mall metaphor that measurement follows intent, right? We learned from the Magic Garden metaphor that we can define a funnel of intent by simply sequencing 2 or more actions. And we also considered the big scope of user data in these 4 quadrants. Now I want to describe a somewhat typical analytics stack at a software startup, like, say, ChartCube. I'll make my way generally from top to bottom, I think. So many companies today, like us, for example, deliver their software to end users on an assortment of platforms: web, mobile, iOS, Android. And so this heterogeneity creates complexity for the analytics in a couple of ways. As regards quadrant 1, being on multiple platforms means you're probably acquiring users on multiple platforms. And so there's data being generated of that sort from different platforms, which are each being conveyed to you probably in different mechanisms. And so this potentially silos campaign and acquisition performance. Or worse, you may find that on some platforms, you can't easily pass quadrant 1 data at all. And I'm kvetching about iOS, because it's really hard right now, for example, in this technology moment, to effectively relate campaign and acquisition data from iOS, from App Store stuff, to deeper product use. It's just something we're working with right now. And so this power to pass data through is enormously important. And I'll talk about that part a bit more when we talk about the analytics of product market fit. So platform homogeneity also complicates things for quadrant 3, product use data, because we log things that happen in the app from the client. Do you guys know what I mean by client? Like it's the software that is installed on your device or on the browser versus like server-side software. So because we instrument in the client, you know, we're again delivering data back through these different mechanisms. For mobile, we rely on third-party SDKs, and software developer kit. At the end of the day, it's just you drop their software into your code so that you can do things. These let you set up the events that you want to telemetrize in your software, like when people log in or create a chart cube. They offer, we use Kissmetrics there, by the way. They offer some internal visualization as part of the tool, some ad hoc querying, and some data extraction capabilities. One thing that they don't do is let you do anything on the object model basis. So one of the things that quickly makes me unhappy with, say, relying entirely on a package like that is the fact that I can't do anything on the object model. So the traditional peer to these SDKs on the website is like Google Analytics. Although Google Analytics does not, in my opinion, work very well with deeper in-product events. I think the usefulness of, I think GA is maybe is a quadrant 1 tool. Although you can set up events, I think beyond basic e-commerce, it's not very useful. And so the homogenization can be either automated or manually. But the point is, what you want to come out of this step so that you can see all of your product use data in the aggregate and have it to be segmentable by platform, right? I want to be able to see users continuously across all of the platforms they've used, and I want to be able to see any number by platform, right? That's the dream, right? So that's why we go to the trouble of this homogenization step. The homogenization step is also a great simplifier of your life if you're going to do ETL, right? It's a lot easier to set up an ETL program if you're working with data that's been pre-processed in this way. And I'll talk more about ETL a little bit later. So from this arrangement, you're typically visualizing on a combination of the built-in charting that comes with these third-party components, like I said, Kissmetrics or Google Analytics, the charts and dashboards that you wire up internally. Many events are server-side, so it's trivial for us to put up basic charts of events with open source charting programs. And we just kind of put those up. So that's one way, and then we enjoy the ability to pull data out of the third parties or from our own database. In our case, it's MongoDB through a SQL interface from which you can export data out in the way you want and enjoy any number of visualization options. And so that's generally how we care about analytics in a software company. Maybe I'll move through this one pretty quickly. What's mapped out here is kind of the scope of activity. When I was at Prezi, the situation analysis there was they had about 6 million users. Something was clearly working. There wasn't a complete metrical understanding of the system, let's say, in terms of what's actually happening and where growth is coming from and how. And also, Prezi's trying to grow up a little bit, trying to leave behind its quirky beginnings as a cool tool used by young people and sort of grow up and be this alternative to PowerPoint. And that's not going so well, by the way. So that's the situation that I inherit when I lead the growth team, and these are some of the things that we do to address that system. So armed with this kind of macro perspective on both user data and the larger behavioral model, the growth team was able to patch some holes in the analytics picture. We created new streams of users to complement the organic model, and we also built some new product stuff that touched the behavioral model in different places. And I'll talk about stuff we did with content in an example in a minute. So I apologize for the bad information architecture of this slide. The idea is that 1 and 1 are together, 2 and 2 are together, 3 and 3 are together, so they kind of connect. Across the top is a representation of the Prezi funnel flowing from left to right. Let me talk about what I mean by activation a little bit, since that may be kind of a foreign term for folks not in software. So activation is a user state. It means the user has learned the product and otherwise been onboarded to the point where they should theoretically go on to use the product indefinitely, right? At Prezi, activation was a tough nut because it's a fairly complex tool with a learning curve. As such, this problem got a lot of attention and a lot of measurement. Even our method of quantifying activation evolved significantly in the time that I was there. We started with a binary signal. Had the user done this or not, right? A lot of noise there, a lot of false positives, etc. And then it evolved into this complex sequence of several things that they had to do in the product before we would consider them activated, right? And so we elevated these signals to this importance as predictors of future retention. Why? Because these behaviors were present in retaining users. It was that kind of an analysis. So the first chart is the individual days cohorts, right? So every step moving from left to right is a different day. And the lines are the different steps on their way to activation that we determined were important for people. So we we exposed that behavior in a sort of a very graphic and actionable way like this. We could see where the big drop-offs were. And so one thing is that this stuff only happened in Prezi in the editor. It's part of the software where you make Prezis. And so one of the mechanical corrections we were able to make to the system once we saw the picture and the data this way was, let's be more aggressive in the product in terms of how we get people into the editor. And of course, lifting that rate, all subsequent rates also rise. The second chart is the distribution of those same activation steps by the number of Prezis they viewed, the buckets, right? And so this was fantastic. Because we had gone to the trouble of creating a data architecture where each individual user's data activation status was written and stored, we could then freely relate those values to other quantities from the user record. So even though we knew instinctively, because it made sense that content was good and it was involved in positive ways in the user cycle and the behavior model, we were able to show with data that there was at least significant correlation between successful activation and consumption of Prezis in advance. So armed with this conclusion, we did a lot more stuff with content in the funnel, building areas of the site where content was exposed in certain ways, the recommendation engine that I spoke of before. Cool stuff. And in the last chart, we show this is individual month cohorts and the percentage retaining into the month at that point, right? So hard to make out at this granularity, but the point there is that cohorts that we'd influenced with content retained longer, right? So we telemetrized the entire experience, and so this is a great sort of self-contained, I guess it's a growth hack, right? I mean, months in work, combination of data insight and product development, but this is totally representative of the kind of stuff that we do at growth teams. So, everybody still passionately interested? Cool. Thank you very much. So, I know that ETL will mean, ETL, anybody, is it in your life? Do you care about it? Hands are getting tired. So I know that it will mean different things to different people, but at least in my mind, I think the promise of a good ETL program is that you can get it working so that it becomes kind of a parallel data stream, right? It's not data from data, it's just data. And I think at Prezi we got ETL working to a high level of volume and reliability, so I wanted to share that with you. So the architecture of this service is that when a user does something we care about in the software, it gives rise to a log writing event, and there's a lot of power in being able to control the formatting of the logs, right? By control the formatting, I mean I want the date field first or there, and et cetera, right? So there's a lot of power in that, and so we use a tool that's actually open sourced from Facebook called Scribe. And since the formatting of the logs that go in strongly influences what you can do on the other side with ETL, it makes a lot of sense to consider your ETL wants when you premeditate formatting these logs. So that works super well. So then these pre-processed logs go into storage somewhere. We did it this way. There are other ways to do it, obviously. And then ETL for us was a nightly process, a package of scripts written in Python that ran on the raw data and wrote its output into structured storage. For example, everybody's activation status, was an ETL job. Activation is the illustrative example here. We cared so much about activation, so we started with the desire we wanted to see activation rate as a daily plot, right? That's like the analyst want. So we have to run through these computational steps, and we're talking like 80,000 signups a day, right? Not to mention the people that are already in the database, which we batch process retroactively. We could have done this a little faster if all we cared about was exposing the daily rate, but we took the trouble to create a whole parallel user table in Hadoop where we could store everybody's activation status, and this opened the door to leveraging that value for all kinds of strategic things like the content example, right? Cool. So this is the last topic, right? Certainly on my mind at ChartQ, we're a new product. So when you build a new kind of software, something that didn't exist before, you begin with a theory. You make a statement like, I believe those people over there will use my thing in this way for these reasons. As a startup, I think you want to take a very active posture towards the uncertainty of product market fit. And what I mean by that is you want to advance an experimental agenda based on progressively better informed theories, right? So rather than a passive posture where you sort of put your thing out there and see who uses it. So this is a framework for, so the assumption is you've made it wrong, at least a little, and so how do you through data and a framework sort of proceed from there to nailing it, right? So that's kind of the idea. And like I said, very, very fresh and recently on my mind, right? So from an analytics standpoint, this is pretty simple. What we want is to compare the behavior of targeted cohorts of users through the product. So this is a quadrant 1 plus quadrant 3 join problem. So much of product market fit comes from what you tell people something is, right? And so in the framework of this experiment is that we have a campus, if you will. I like this word because it comes out of Facebook growth. They started with just one campus and they spread to other campuses. And so for me, as a growth person, I like to think of markets in terms of campuses similarly, right? So you premeditate your campus. Maybe one campus is people who attend the PASS, BAC Analytics Conference, right? Then because what you tell your campus something is a big part of how you will see product market fit metrically in the product later, you construct a different what is it message for each campus, right? You guys know Facebook started as kind of a hot or not variant, right? But they had this loose idea about what they were and were able to sort of very quickly evolve in the direction of that peak product market fit. Again, not every product has the potential to be used by billions of people, but the methodology is the same. And so the last thing I want to ask you guys is a favor, right? So we think at ChartQ we've kind of created this amazing thing that lets people who already have it as a part of their job to create visualizations and share them with others. We think we've made something incredible for them, right? But like, there's no software that does that before. So what do you call it, right? So I'm going to ask you what you guys think, right? So one idea is data presentation. Here we borrow from the fact that many people make PowerPoints, from data. They make charts. This is the model shared through email attachments that people follow, right? Data presentation. That's one possibility. Another possibility is interactive mobile dashboard, right? That you share with your team. So here we build on, people kind of know what a dashboard is. You set them up, sometimes in Excel, sometimes in other tools. And because what we do is remarkably interactive, we bring that word to the fore, even if you're not quite sure what we mean when we say interactive dashboard. And then there's data analytics for teams, right? Something simple, you kind of don't know what it means yet, but it's very specific. Data analytics and collaboration for teams, right? So it's bringing together analytics and collaboration for the first time. So data presentation. Everybody like that one? No? Mobile interactive dashboard. Okay. So the last one is analytics and collaboration for teams. All right. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for participating in this indulgent experiment. And thank you very much for having me here. I really, like I said, appreciate the opportunity to bring this stuff to you guys. So, questions? All right. Don't be shy. Yes, sir. Available? I think that has already happened. I think you can already get it on the site if you're registered. Yes. Yeah. Cool. Which one? Oh, you want to see stuff from the beginning? All right. Well. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe it's not fair to everybody else. There's a lot in here, but there it is. I'll kind of zip through it. Did you guys like the metaphor stuff? Was it too fluffy up front? It was kind of a risk. You're hardcore analytics people. Soften you up a little bit with some mind candy first. Did that work? How did this compare to what you were expecting? Anyone? Any idea? What were you guys expecting? Just kind of showing up, see what you. Oh, hey.
Quick question.
Yeah, man.
Can you go back to the content slide that you had?
Yeah.
Rather a great presentation, like the ideas that you presented.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
Just a quick question on who are you and what you have done. Can you share some of the tools that you use for user tracking for 2 and 3?
Yeah, 2 and 3. So the most exciting thing we did there was at Prezi. And the motivating thing here is that desire to have the data the way you want, right? As opposed to any of the hoops you have to jump through to get it out or whatever. And so to that end, we built what my tech lead described, ironically, as half of Google Analytics, right? That was his ironic way of saying, dude, we're building something that kind of already exists, but absent this critical part of being able to sort of store the data proximal in the way we want to other data, to product use data. So what we did there was we modified our own cookie. We had already done a lot of work on the cookie at Prezi for example, that's how we did source tracking. We just added a param to the URL, and when somebody signed up, we would write a value to the database. So the cookie had become, our friend, and so we just build power. It started with, this simple registration tracking behavior. We expanded it to geolocation, intelligent, capturing our own IP, doing our own lookups, processing geolocation data, storing it as such in the user record. Stuff that comes out of the browsers, of course, was interesting, the user language. The last thing, which was really exciting, is when we saw that content was so interesting and so important as part of the user lifecycle, we really wanted to sort of see that completely, even before people signed up. So the last big thing we did is, here's that. So extended anonymous web logging. That was very cool. So what we did there is we gave in our database every user, even before they'd lined up, a temporary anonymous ID, stored a bunch of stuff in connection with that anonymous ID, and then joined it to the permanent user record if and when they completed a registration. That was fantastic. We could see everything from where they came from on their first visit, the 8 Prezis they'd seen, in the first week, and then ultimately what they did right before they signed up. And then, of course, everything after. Seamless user record. Spectacular. Do it if you can.
Awesome. So just to sum up, it seems like you're using most.
So in that case, it was strong reliance on Hadoop. I described the structure through which, so what we did is, there were many structures that stored user data. They were essentially, homogeneously accessible, so essentially in one place. So, for example, the activation table where we stored that. So we created lots of structures of that sort where that suited our purposes. For example, we wouldn't bog down the primary user record with all the noise that came out of the web logging stuff, right? I mean, we'd build that somewhere else, right? But the idea was that the data we brought in. And so broadly, we relied on Hadoop and pig scripting to get the data we want, and we showed most of the important metrics that were a combination of simpler stuff that we had instrumented, like a daily count of that thing, to the complicated computationally intensive stuff that were coming out of the ETL processes, which still wrote to a value to a table every day that we could then put on like good data. And that's how we did it, right? But, you know, Prezi was like 80 people at that point, and 50% of the company is involved in data extraction. So spectacularly data-intensive environment, not at all representative of the typical startup at all. Yeah, man.
You just said that with that, you allow them to have these default IDs, that just random IDs that were
Right.
associated with them, that maybe it was like by session or something,
Right.
whatever. So how did you mitigate distributed attacks?
Oh, dude, so part of this work, of course, as with many things you build, is this the stuff that happens once you've built it and sees the ways in which it breaks and is flawed. So the first thing we had to contend with was an enormous quantity of non-human visitors, right? So we spent a while, you know, suppressing that. So what we truly had was visitor count. But yeah, it was generally, we built it with a certain sense of how we wanted it to work. We saw that it was broken from this way. We adapted like that, right? So that we created filters is the answer to your question. We created filters.
That's a very detailed. You have to put a lot of time into that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when you have a login or engagement registration, it really deters a lot of people from using the tool.
Yeah.
I mean, I just created a very simple application, and you turn it from, you have to sign up before you do the application, to using the phone ID. You can link it to a register later if you want to.
Right.
That huge difference in
Yeah.
volume of users that utilize it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to reduce friction when you don't absolutely need it, right? Like we wanted to let people view Prezis anonymously. Why? Because it mattered and it was distributive. Other questions? Cool. Well, it was awesome, guys. I'm Jack at ChartCube. If, while you're all still sitting there, I will make you watch this. Probably not be able to hear it, though. Oh, yeah, I'll be surprised. Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So you guys ever heard of sandwich video? It's this guy, Adam Lizagore, kind of famous now. He's himself in the TrueCar commercial. He's this bearded guy, you know. So anyway, we got hooked up with him, and he's like the darling now of Silicon Valley. He did the Slack video. If you go to slack.com, it's his video on their homepage, and they say, yeah, we tried Slack. So we got them to make our video, and it's a lot better when you can hear it. But this is ChartCube, right? So we take a tabular data set, we run some pretty awesome algorithms through it, and we enact this cube instantaneously right from your pivot table ready spreadsheet. The cleverness is that we make good guesses about what's probably a metric, what's probably a grouping or a dimension, and then we arrange those things as charts on a cube that you just flip through left and right. You change the metrics left to right, change the grouping up and down, and then the beautiful third gesture is double tap any value to drill down. So it's this super light. Fast Company called it the Instagram of business data, right? So it's the opposite of Tableau. Tableau is Photoshop. So when you want a quick, fast visualization, when the intent is to share with someone and you don't want to bother them with technical difficulty of any sort, or being, you know, themselves, or even knowing Excel. So that's ChartCube. I'm going to leave you with that. I think you guys have been very indulgent in letting me be promotional. Thank you. I appreciate it.